probably you heard lovely voice. Yes, so today, our main speaker is Dr. Rodrigo Young, research fellow in Institute of Ophthalmology and Faculty of Brain Sciences at University College London. And he is also a founder of Diagnosis Biotech, so probably he will mention that as well, and author of many scientific articles, and one of them, so he will be presenting today. So as you can see the title on the screen, and yes, I will give the floor to Dr. Young so he can tell us more about this topic.
Hi everybody, and thanks for coming here, for being interested in this work. I'm going to tell you like broadly what we have developed at Diagnosis Biotech as a response to the COVID pandemic. Okay, so if I can move the next slide, there you go. So I'm a researcher, as Barbara mentioned. I work on eye development in zebrafish in humans at the Institute of Ophthalmology. And I study the compensatory mechanisms that enable robustness in eye formation. What does this mean? It means that sometimes embryos develop smaller eyes that shouldn't be viable because of mutations, for example. But regardless of that, the system compensates and the eyes reach the normal size. So I'm fascinated about this question. And we're studying these compensatory mechanisms. So because we work on genetics, I've done thousands of or hundreds of thousands of PCRs in my life, and in my lab now, my students do as well. And because of this, I understand very well the problem or the limitations of the technique itself. Okay, and just like many of us last year in March 2020, I was in London here in this little arrow here that you can see, and the pandemic was declared. Elder people were dying. There was a lockdown in London, and my colleagues were fleeing to their summer homes. So I decided that I would do the same, and I would go back home to maybe take care of my parents if it was needed. So I was in Chile for a while last year, and while I was writing grants, I of course became very aware of the big problematic of the pandemic, which was that asymptomatic people spread the virus and are not regularly tested because testing is very expensive. At that point, we didn't have this problem. This is the current problem of the pandemic, that anti-vaxxers are threatening the vaccination efforts. And the other problematic of the pandemic that we currently face is that there's the constant emergence of variants and strains of the COVID virus. And the main challenge remains the same, basically, that we need to identify the people that are spreading the disease by regular mass testing to generate or to isolate early and to avoid the spreading of COVID-19. And particularly, it's very important that most of the people, or many people that are contagious, are asymptomatic. So they're spreading the disease without knowing. And this together last year goes very well hand in hand with the fact that Paul Romer, this Nobel Prize economist, said that we should invest all our effort and money in testing. Of course, as we know, that didn't happen, and the pandemic crossed borders and went global. But the question remained the same, you know, how can we test more efficiently, or how can we test more people in an accurate way? Okay, and that's when I came to this notion, like, of aiming to generate a simple, low-cost, non-invasive method to test for SARS-CoV-2. I realized that the reason behind the using of mobile phones was that shortly after doing a little bit of research on why COVID PCR nasopharyngeal tests were so expensive, was the fact that it was using a human sample. Okay, and as soon as you take a human sample, the processing or the manipulation, the trajectory of that sample towards developing a test is very expensive because it falls in the realm of a clinical setup. So you have to have a certain certified reagents to or certified transport media to put the nasopharyngeal sample in. Then the transport is very clear. The sample has to be taken by people that are certified or have a certain capacity, in a clinical setup. It has to be developed in a clinical setup. And then the reagents used to do the PCR and all that are a lot more expensive than are usually than the usual reagents we use in the lab. So that's when I thought of using an indirect measure of a person, not a direct measure, to avoid the whole clinical loop the samples have to travel through. And I thought of using the mobile phone because the mobile phone is the device we're most in contact with constantly. Okay. And I generated a very small pilot. I contacted colleagues in Chile, and this was the pre-pilot. And I want to emphasize how important people are in our career and our life in general, because if we generate good interactions, like I've been lucky to do, these people here were instrumental in helping this pre-pilot. So basically, me together with Eva Bustamante, who's a colleague with which we studied biochemistry in the University of Chile. We teamed up with Luis Quiñones, who's a professor at the University of Chile, to take just a few samples with very rudimentary setup. So we didn't have much. We took the swabs and we just pass it through the phone of people that we know were contagious. And interestingly enough, and it's not a coincidence, our first subject was Professor Luis Quiñones. He was diagnosed with COVID one day, and we went to his house and we tested his phone, and his phone amazingly worked. So the sample we took from his phone, when we tested, we did the RT-PCR in the lab, and actually in his lab, turned out to be positive. We did the same thing with another 10 subjects, and all 10 turned to be positive as well. And this was the first proof of principle that this could work. I'm also showing here one of my mentors, Miguel Allende in Chile, and Dr. Christian Duraga that works in his lab. They were also super important for this pre-pilot because there were no stock, or there was very few materials available in Santiago at the moment to be sold to do this project, because everybody was using a lot of tips and a lot of tubes. So it was all mostly used for COVID. Nobody was selling this stuff, or there wasn't stock available. And Miguel in his lab, they had a good stock of all these things, and he helped us with that material. So if it wasn't because of these guys, this project wouldn't have happened. So as soon as we realized this was an idea that could work, we called this this method phone screen testing, POST. And this figure, or this photo, reflects very well what we do. So we just pass the swab through the screen of the phone. We put it inside this tube, and then this tube travels to the lab where we process the sample. Okay, so of course, 10 samples is not enough to show that this works or to validate it. So we went ahead and we collaborated. I first of all funded Diagnosis Biotech to develop this whole idea. And we collaborated with this clinic called Clínica Dávila in Santiago, Chile, to validate this technique. So we sampled COVID-19 symptomatic and asymptomatic people that needed testing because of a COVID close contact, traveling, or work. So basically anybody that would go to the clinic would to get a nasopharyngeal test. We would also test for POST, okay? And we did a little survey to understand a little bit better the circumstances of the person. And so we would ask the age, sex, and if they had symptoms. And one very important question was if whether they claimed their mobile phone. Because of course, if they clean their mobile phone, and there's a correlation between people that are positive, test positive for nasopharyngeal testing, PCR testing, and we can't find the sample as positive in their phone, it could be because they're cleaning the phone. So cleaning the phone could be a way to neutralize or to avoid us finding this virus. And as you'll show later, this wasn't the case. So our testing pipeline, if we compared phone screen testing compared to nasopharyngeal PCR testing, the sampling process in our case was performed by trained students. So we didn't need any clinically trained people. Nasopharyngeal testing, as we know, requires clinical staff. The sample media is a very simple low phosphate media that's very inexpensive. And in the case of nasopharyngeal, it has to use quite pricey sometimes. The viral transport media, it's called. We store the samples at 4 degrees for long-term storage. It's not really necessary to store them for long-term, but what we know is that if we store them at 4 degrees, we can repeat the PCR in these samples for those that are positive, and they can last for weeks. So that's a very interesting thing, considering that most people think that RNA or virus could be quite unstable in samples. In our experiences, they're not as unstable as you would expect. And the sample processing in the case of phone screen testing is very simple. We do 5 sample pools. So we pull together 5 samples, and we just do a very brief 10-minute 70-degree incubation in a water bath. And then that sample is used directly to do an RT-PCR reaction. In the case of nasopharyngeal sampling, you can do an X number of pools. I think it's between 5 and 10. But then you also have to do an RNA extraction, which makes the process a lot more expensive. And then, of course, the RT-PCR reaction using clinically certified reagents. So we first did a pilot, and we call it a pilot because we also didn't have many samples available, because the level of contagiousness, the level of infectivity in Santiago of Chile at that moment was very low. Okay, and what this histogram depicts here is the people or the cases that were positive for nasopharyngeal samples. So all the bars are positive for nasopharyngeal sampling, and the distribution here is the distribution of the CT value of these samples. As probably most of you know, the CT value is the number of cycles that it requires for a positive sample to turn out positive. So basically, if there's a lot of RNA, you're going to need a very few cycles in the thermocycling machine to show positive, because there was a lot of material to start with. If you have a very little material that is still positive, you will need a lot more cycles, because the level of amplification required is higher. Okay, so we saw, interestingly, two groups of patients. A group with a high viral load and a group with a lower viral load. And what was interesting to us was that those with high viral load, which require fewer cycles to be detected, were mostly detected by our method, by post. Okay. On the contrary, the ones that had a very low viral load or a high CT value were not as easy to detect for us. And this makes sense, because we understand now that the people with high viral load are the ones that are contagious. So if you're in the peak of the disease, you are spreading the disease as well. As you get better, or if you're just going in or you're getting better, the odds of you spreading the disease are lower, and hence the probability of finding samples in your phone is also lower as well. So the sensitivity we found for those people with a low viral load was around 95.8%. And of course, this varies. We plot here the accumulative CT value intervals. Okay, so these are the number of cases with a CT value of 17 or less, 19 or less, and so on. And we can see here how the sensitivity of the post method compared to the nasopharyngeal sampling works. So of course, at very low CT value, there's 100% correlation between the nasopharyngeal sample and the post sampling. As the CT value increases, because there's less because there's less viral load, the sensitivity goes down, but remarkably, within a very big range, the sensitivity is still over 90%. So this was very encouraging. But at one point we had to stop here because the positivity rate was so low in Santiago of Chile that we were doing hundreds of PCRs and we were finding very, very few positives. So we had to wait for the next wave of contagiousness in Santiago. And this is when the validation of this technique happened. So even though we had we only tested 764 compared to 500 here, we found a lot more positive cases for nasopharyngeal sample. In this case, I don't remember how many positives were there, but there were in total, both pilot and validation study, we reached around 190 cases. Okay, and what's interesting here again is that the distribution of the CT cases is different. Okay, it looks like when there's a higher rate in the population, there is a trend for the patients to have a higher viral load, hence a lower CT value. And again, interestingly, the high viral load correlates mostly with the samples that are also positive for post in blue in the bars. Okay. However, the sensitivity showed with bigger numbers was slightly lower, but remarkably for high viral load, it's still over 80%, which is very good for a test that's not considered a clinical test. And again, here when we look at the accumulated CT value intervals, we can see that, of course, at a very low or very high viral load, very low CT, the correlation is 100%, and then it starts dropping as you decrease the viral load of the samples that we're studying. What's very important to take into account is that these samples were processed independently. So the nasopharyngeal samples were processed by the clinic lab, and the post samples were processed by our lab at Diagnosis Biotech, and we didn't know the results of each other till the next day. So it was a blind experiment in that sense. So we weren't fooling each other, trying to get higher sensitivity. Okay. So another important thing to take into account is that there was a very good correlation not just with the positive, but with the negatives. The rate of negatives that we found were very similar to the ones we were found in the nasopharyngeal testing, giving us a specificity of around 98, 97% for the pilot and the validation cohort, respectively. So our conclusions were that that post is a non-invasive method by which we are able to identify contagious or mostly contagious COVID-19 positive individuals at a very high sensitivity. And post is also able to identify asymptomatic, and this is something I didn't mention before. This is very important because if you want to conduct efforts to somehow stop the spreading of the virus, identifying asymptomatic people is probably one of the most important things, because they're like the main driving force of the pandemic. And most importantly as well, to enable mass testing or like broad epidemiological surveillance. The cost of post is very low because it does not require clinical staff or facilities or reagents. I'm sorry, there was a little bit of Spanish here dropped. So it's not, it reduces the price compared to nasopharyngeal sampling. So we propose that post is a pre-diagnostic method for efficient, non-invasive and low-cost COVID-19 testing. And where are all these things going now? We will soon, sponsored by a Chilean grant and in collaboration with people in Santiago of Chile and in London at UCL, the university where I work at, we're going to start evaluating the use of post for testing for tuberculosis. Probably, I don't know if you guys know, but I didn't until not long ago, that tuberculosis has not been eradicated as most people think. There's a lot of countries where tuberculosis is an issue, and not only in underdeveloped countries, but in developed countries like in the UK, where there's pockets of tuberculosis in different parts of the city. It would be really interesting to use this pre-testing or pre-diagnosis testing to aid the testing of people in a quick and cheap way and an easy way to bring the rates of tuberculosis down. The eradicating tuberculosis in the world is one of the aims of the World Health Organization by 2030, and we hope we can contribute somehow to that aim. And the other step that we're working on is that we're designing and manufacturing a post-sampling machine for which we have a preliminary patent filed. So of course, it works taking your own sample or a person taking your sample that knows how to do it very well. But if we want to avoid or reduce the risk of the staff that take samples to be COVID, so be ill by COVID, we need to avoid the exposure of these people. And the other thing is that if we had a machine that's able to take samples from people's phones, people could be tested at any time, and then the samples would just have to travel to the lab to be used. Of course, in a future iteration, in the first iteration, the machine will only take the sample, and samples will travel to a lab. But in future iterations of this machine, we hope that it will include the sampling and the analysis of the sample in the same machine. So the people that worked on this small but probably very relevant project were part of the Clínica Dávila in Santiago that were very, very helpful and instrumental in sharing data and also making things easier for us in the diagnostics, COVID diagnostics floor. At Diagnosis Biotech, Camila Solis, who's in charge of our lab, was fundamental to make this happen. She's a driving force, and she's a force of nature that makes the impossible happen as well. And at the University of Chile, in the Faculty of Medicine, the whole team of Luis Quiñones, or not the whole team, but part of the team of Luis Quiñones, collaborated with us to especially in the pre-pilot stage of this technique. And something I didn't mention, which is the work that people in the University of Santiago of Chile did, which was to test the post samples, to test if we could identify COVID variants. And to a certain extent, we were successful. I didn't mention this because it's still an ongoing study, but the limitation is that we can detect COVID variants only in the samples that have a very, very high viral load, even in the phone. So if there's a threshold at which we really can't detect if it goes under a certain threshold, and that's making things a little bit more difficult for us. And here at UCL in London, Dr. Garth Dixon was providing a lot of samples to understand this seeming binary distribution in the histogram of CT cases that we didn't understand at the beginning, but then we thought we think we understood that it's because there's a different incidence, and the incidence of COVID in the population is reflected on the distribution of CT cases in this histograms that I showed. So with that, I can take questions. I see Fernand is here. Hi, Fernand. Thanks for inviting me to give this talk.
Should we raise hands, or we just go ahead? It's a small
just go ahead. Yeah, we're not that many, so it's easy.
So maybe I missed something, but I'm not sure where exactly is the main savings from your sampling of the telephones, because is it just mainly the viral transport media, or?
It's at different stages. So one of the savings is that if you don't require the qualified staff, the salary is a lot cheaper, one. You don't need a clinical setup, so the sample can be taken anywhere. Yeah. Then the phosphate media we use is just peanuts. It's dirt cheap compared to viral media, viral transport media. The other very important one that is, I think, around $7 to $8 for each sample is the RNA extraction of the sample. So that makes cost really, really high. And then all the reagents for clinical PCRs are orders of magnitude more expensive compared to regular RT-PCR reagents that we use in the lab all the time. Surprisingly, they're a lot more expensive, probably because the getting those certifications must be difficult, you know. So we don't have to do any of that, and it's the same good old RT enzyme and PCR and polymerase, you know, and then primers and probes for TaqMan, you know, it's very, very straightforward. So as we say in the paper, we in the discussion, we point out the costs, and the costs can be reduced between 10 and 17-fold compared to like regular PCR nasopharyngeal testing. So it is remarkably cheaper.
But in the end, the RT-PCR is sort of the standard TaqMan thing. And so detecting the variants is really just about having enough that aren't mutated so much. I mean, the S will drop out if the spike protein mutant isn't bound by the primer anymore.
Yeah, that is true. That could happen. And that's something we are constantly keeping an eye on, that our primers are still working. But luckily enough, you know, it looks like the mutation rate pressure is not very high on the S protein, on the N protein. So we don't detect the S protein, which is the tricky one that's generating mutations all the time. We detect the N protein, of course.
Yeah,
And
well, Ferdinand even said that there isn't much delta in Chile yet.
Well, it's growing in Chile. I think it will.
Okay.
The thing in Chile is that because things are more relaxed here now, there's less testing. So it's what you don't want to see, of course you don't find. But it looks like for what we know from like information we have for the companies we work, the number of cases is starting to grow again. So most probably there will be another a Delta wave. And there's also new variants emerging all the time, you know. They're talking about a Colombian variant now. So yeah, I don't think this problem will go away in the short term. One problem is the anti-vaxxers, you know. The other day I was just walking around London, and there was a manifestation. It was thousands of people. And in the States, we know that they're hitting a wall in terms of vaccination. And if you don't vaccinate that extra 40%, this virus will linger around for a while. And as we know, I mean, I was just chatting with friends the other day. Even if you're vaccinated, some people end up in the hospital. So you can catch it again, and you can get very ill. So it's not. I don't think we shouldn't get too complacent about this. So what we hope, to be honest, because that was the original motivation behind this project, is to provide a way to test everyone. So the mathematical models show that if you test 70% of the population every week, the pandemic is over in 2 months. You know? So maybe it'd be worth trying testing a lot of people for 2 months, and then
it worked in China.
Yeah, it did work in China. Yeah, it did work in China till it didn't work anymore because the variants came from outside. But yes, it would be. I think it would be a wise way to spend our money rather than dealing with the consequences in the economy. Yeah. Hey, Diego, I can see you there.
So a lot of us have also been looking into trying to make different tests to become sort of commercial. And the idea of starting and founding a biotech company has really sort of put a few of our team off. We've been
really?
working on one of these isothermal amplification methods. and it also
Yeah.
uses the N gene. But
Sure.
I'm just wondering how much of your life is taken up by having founded this company, or
Well,
it's thanks to this woman who's doing all the moving and shaking. Or you need to find someone who really wants to devote their life to it, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, it takes a considerable amount of my time, not my hands really, because Camila Solis, she's excellent in the lab, and she's developed a whole team to run the lab. Actually, I'm not in Chile, I'm in London.
Now you're
But
in London.
working on this as a startup also requires a lot of managing and work with my business partners as well. So that is taking a substantial amount of my time. So I have like 2 jobs now. But again, this idea and the motivation behind it is so relevant that it just keeps us going, even though it's a lot of work. We're very happy to do it. And the company is growing well. We're taking more tests. At the moment, we're mostly testing companies, because the government has been a bit difficult to deal with, because they don't know what to do with us, because they can't regulate it. You know, they don't understand it. It's so the health people say it's not a human sample, so it's not into the health loop, and the rest say, well, what do we do with this? So interestingly enough, companies have taken the risk, and they've gone with us, and they're very happy about it, because it's a non-invasive method, so people are really happy. So once they start working with us, they don't leave. The adherence of the system is quite good. Yeah. So where are you? Sorry, Rachel.
So I'm near Lausanne in Switzerland.
Okay, nice. Yeah, that's quite a hub for biotech, isn't it?
Well, there's a lot of people doing this whole startup thing and all these accelerators and everything. I mean, I felt some pressure that we should just go for it. But yeah, right now we're working more on the production end. We're just trying to see if we can get standardized large-scale production first, and then in various countries, we'll see if the regulators will accept it.
Sure. So what are you working on in particular?
Samples and saliva and so on.
Also using saliva samples?
Yeah.
And now you're using our RT isothermal as well. Yeah, I thought about using isothermal, but I was kind of cautious and decided not going that way, because in my experience, unless you use a qPCR, a real-time PCR machine, to really look at the amplification and the kinetics amplification, you could fall into a lot of false positives. So if you only use the pH change, it will be crazy, you know.
No way.
There's companies in Chile doing that, and I don't know. I think it's very risky, you know. I decided going for a PCR rather than doing the cheap way, because
well, our method, it uses the quenched fluorescence method to detect. So there's a bit of sequence specificity there. And so we don't get a lot of false positives.
Excellent.
But I mean, there's always the worry that somebody's going to open a tube after the reaction is run. And if you open a positive tube, then you're in trouble. So
that was my other fear, you know. Getting rid of a contamination as isothermal DNA generates is almost impossible.
So, even with PCR, it's bad, but with isothermal amplification, it's way worse.
Exactly. So I decided going the conservative way, and we're very happy with how it's working. We don't have our false positive rate is nearly 0. Yeah.
And did you ever spike somebody's phone with like inactivated virus as some extra controls, or compare sensitivity to like the fast tests?
You know, that's what we're doing now. The problem is that the rate of COVID is very low in Santiago. So we had to stop, because we were doing thousands of tests every week, and we were getting 2 positive.
Negative.
So but if the cases start growing again, we will continue our study comparing the lateral flow antigen tests. And for that, interestingly enough, so far we have nearly 100% correspondence. So it's really we're very happy about that, and of course we're also continuing the study for variants, to look for variants, and we do that 2 ways. We use kits, and we also do sequencing, like regular Sanger sequencing. And in my experience, Sanger sequencing is bulletproof. You know, those tests, I always have my doubts. If you get a negative, it doesn't mean that it's not there. But if you can look at a chromatogram,
yeah, and if you have a PCR band that you can actually send off to quickly sequence, then you're good. But yeah, you don't want to do that sort of thing with isothermal.
No, you can't do that. So that's another advantage we have. So we have a certain level of success in detecting variants. So that is another good thing about the method that I don't mention in the talk, really, because we still haven't fully validated, and we don't know the limits of detection of our technique for variants. But there are samples where we can do it. We can't do it with every single one of them, but with a few we can, and we still have to add more cases because our N is very low. We have less than 20 because the cases are so few at the moment. Yeah.
And if people do turn out positive, then you tell them to get another test, to get the standard test.
Exactly,
and go quarantine.
exactly. Well, for two reasons. Because this is out of the regulatory loop in the health system. Okay, so if it would be unethical to just say, yeah, quarantine or don't quarantine. They have to do a PCR test. But the good thing in our favor is that every time we find a positive, they're positive for, like, on the regular nasopharyngeal testing, and which is quite obvious because you won't find anything on your phone if you weren't contagious, you know. Yeah. One thing I didn't mention that's interesting is that trying to clean or disinfect the phone doesn't make any difference. And we think the reason for that is that the disinfectant disinfects probably, but the corpse of the virus is still there. And PCR is such a sensitive technique that you can still find it.
So maybe the RNA gets precipitated a little bit or something. The envelope gets broken.
Exactly.
But it's not going to.
But it's still there. Yeah. And regarding cross-contamination, that is also a classic fear because phones get shared sometimes. What was really interesting in the validation study that we did in Clínica d'Ávila was that sometimes big families came that lived in one tiny space. You know, there's poverty in Chile, you know, and there's ghettos sometimes, and I remember at least 3 examples where big families would come, like around 10 people, and they would say, well, we share a phone, so maybe you'll find that we're all positive, you know. But what was interesting is that for all those cases, we only identified as positive the person that was positive by nasopharyngeal sampling. And I think that the reason for that is that there has to be a certain accumulation of sample on the phone. You know, it's not enough to just share the phone a little while. You have to accumulate a certain amount of sample. So yeah, I know. Yeah. I
don't like to touch other people's phones.
Well, after this talk, probably you will never do it. Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? So. Yeah.
So Fernan wrote in the chat that he can't talk. I feel bad that I'm just talking the whole time, but Fernan actually has some of our tests and is going to be doing a bunch of clinical validations. We were just talking to someone from his lab today about the protocol.
Oh, cool. So. Excellent. Well, good luck with that. Yeah.
We need it.
We all do. Yeah.
I'd rather the people just stop spreading it around.
Yep. Yeah.
Hi, Rodrigo. Thank you very much. It's very nice presentation and information as well.
Thank you.
I'm Anif. I'm currently working in the University of Turbat, just looking in Pakistan. That we are, and I'm basically industrial biotechnology section. So I just really working with enzymes on something microbial enzyme production and culture consortium and like that. But I just have one very simple question regarding the collection of the samples. Do you collect? Why you select only phone for the sample collection, not another equipment, for example, in trace of person, that's or something in the sources, and as well come here. Another thing, why you did you process the samples, both sample and nasopharyngeal and phone samples into a similar way to check that both giving a similar results or not? So, for example, that the phone is you test in a cheap way on pharyngeal, which even done a very expensive or PCR based. Did you exchange the method between them, that the pharyngeal or pharyngeal into something like that? One is more, did you use the same person for testing their mobile as well as their pharyngeal for
Sorry, I missed the last part. Sorry, what did you ask?
last part is the same person, which is the person which is you are testing for testing his phone. So you also collect a sample of his nasal pharyngeal as well?
Yes, yeah, that was done in parallel. Okay, so the same person,
perfect.
the same person gets an nasopharyngeal sampling and a phone testing sample, and that was what compared, and that's what I showed in the histograms for the CT values. The CT values are for the nasopharyngeal samples. Okay.
No.
So which was the first question? Sorry.
For the processing of samples, did you exchange the process between the both samples, phones and pharyngeal samples?
We didn't actually, and I think from that point of view, our test is less stringent in the sense that we only tested one gene. You know, the clinical samples test 2 or 3 genes, just in case one of the reaction fails. So we did it a little bit more difficult in our case because I really wanted to test the extreme conditions where you only have the capacity to test for one gene because you don't have any money. Okay. And probably, or maybe if we would have tested 2 or 3 genes, our sensitivity would have even increased. But the important thing is that even testing one gene, the sensitivity is very high. So that really proves or makes a case for this kind of method. Yeah. Yeah. So the next question, which was it? I'm sorry.
I know what is why is phone? Did you compare in other sample, other cloth or something like that?
Well, we thought about the phone like for a few reasons. You know, the surface of the phone is quite amenable for sampling. It's easy to sample a phone, you know. And the other one is that the phone is one of the objects that people are most touching constantly, you know, and talking into, you know. So I wanted to try, I also thought about trying, for example, the screen of laptops or the keyboard of laptops. Yeah. Because that's the other object we use a lot, you know, our laptops, computers. But we finally decided for phones because they're very much a personal use and they're more in close contact with people. And because this was a race, to be honest, we were really trying to be as quick as possible to get this data out. We had to settle for one. Yeah. But when I did that pilot test of these 10 people, then we also tested their computers. And interestingly enough, we didn't get like the same kind of agreement compared to the phone. So it was better to use the phone.
Thank you very much.
This is really fascinating. As someone who is coming from non-scientific environment background, actually, I'm learning so much. And also when you mentioned about TB, tuberculosis, and also that the next step that could be to test tuberculosis. Actually, I used to work in Public Health England, and we worked with our partners in France, and specifically on the health priority TB, and in London and in Paris. And it happened to be, and it was a few years ago, that it's a one of top issue. I was also really shocked. It's like, wow, yeah. Yeah,
I at least had this vision from the movies, you know,
that
they show people going into the Alps to get cured of tuberculosis as a thing of the past. But it was quite shocking to realize, for example, in Chile, there's 2,000 new cases of tuberculosis every year. And they mostly come through the north of Chile, through the migration path. Okay. The reason I decided going for tuberculosis is it has many reasons. One of them is because it's in the subconscious of people. You know, it's a disease you can relate to. You know, if you talk about a certain herpes or something like more odd or a weird virus, but tuberculosis you can relate to. And also it's a public health problem that to a certain extent or to a good extent has been addressed. So there's a whole pipeline, and the public health system is taking care of it. So then we can generate another intervention in parallel and work on it, you know. And then because it's closely monitored, if that intervention has an effect, you will be able to quantify it, so you can measure. So all these things make tuberculosis a very interesting problem. So we hope to be soon measuring for tuberculosis in the north of Chile, and maybe after 6 months or a year of testing, we could see a drop in the levels of TB in Chile. So that would be great.
Yeah, I really hope it will work. And yes, I'm aware that it's almost 1 hour, but are there any other questions to our speaker? I know that Rachel has asked already many, but it was very insightful too.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel.
There's so few people, but yeah, it's great with the TB. There's a big TB program here also.
Cool. Yeah.
So I just realized through these community meetings and networks and forums that actually networking is such a valuable and powerful source. Even we are 6 of us here, but we can really work better together and stay in touch. So which I really invite you to stay in touch as well through our website.
Rachel, if you, I can't see your last name, so if you can get in touch with me, that would be great.
Sure.
Yeah, because you have my full name.
Okay. Then I can get your paper too.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh yes, the paper. I should have actually sent the link to the paper. But I thank you so much for the presentation. It was very interesting, very insightful. So we will also put the recording on the website, and I mean without a discussion. And yes, so paper link is important. Yes. I don't know if maybe Rodrigo.
I can get it quite quick.
Yes, so maybe we can post it here in the chat room.
Yeah, just give me a second. Actually, I think one of the best parts of the talk was the discussion. So maybe you should also. Yeah,
I'm wondering. Yeah, maybe actually we should. if there is no objection.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, so we have.
There's a paper if you want it. I just posted in the chat.
The paper, and yes, and thank you so much for participating. And I just wanted to ask this question. I mean, if probably it's all networks and forums are struggling with, if there is any volunteers who would like to join us, our network, and or the place that there are like students are interested, so please let me know and I would be really grateful. But other than that, so we have community meetings every 2 weeks and different various topic, and today it was extremely interesting. So yes, I will be publishing this on a website, and yes, so thank you so much, and I wish you the afternoon, evening, no, probably afternoon for most of us. Yes, so yes, please stay in touch and see you soon.
See ya. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Nice talk.
Cheers. Thank you.